Welcome to TheKillFile, your favorite true crime podcast. I'm your host, Brittany Spears. Each week, we will explore the dark corners of true crime, unsolved mysteries, and murder. Join me as we uncover secrets, investigate evidence, and dive into the chilling details of some of the most fascinating cases. Get ready for a journey into the dark unknown because, in TheKillFile, nothing stays buried forever. Hello there, and welcome to episode 72 of TheKillFile. I'm so glad that you guys came back for another story. Real quick before we jump in, I'm sure as you can already tell that my voice sounds like shit. My family got sick again. I am so sorry if it bothers you. Hopefully I will be back to normal next week, but what can I do about it? Before we jump into today's case, a few quick reminders. First, check out the website at thekillfile.com where you can find the merch shop. We have anything from clothes to bags, even dog shirts. You are sure to find something that you love or a nice gift for the holidays for a true crime lover in your life. While you are there, you can submit a listener file story if you would like for the new bonus content that is now out on Patreon. The category of listener files will be stories that you guys write in, either maybe about a hometown murder that stuck out to you or one near you now. Maybe it freaked you out, or these can be your own true crime experiences. Even someone you know who went through something is okay. If you want to send them in, please share. Maybe your neighbor was a serial rapist and you had no idea because he was seemingly so nice. Maybe your niece married a mobster, or maybe even your dog saved a family from an intruder. Dark or light, long or short, write those stories into the TheKillFile podcast at Gmail, or as mentioned before, you can fill out the form on the website. Listener files is just one category of the new bonus content that is now out over on the Patreon called The Hidden Files. If you're interested in paying a few bucks a month for some bonus content from me, I would say sign up. The categories for the Hidden Files are anything from plane crashes to natural disasters, things that are circling true crime, but they will be a little different than our normal Monday episodes. So join us. You can find the link on the website or visit patreon.com/killfile and sign up. Lastly, please take a second to subscribe, follow, rate, review, and all of that good stuff. It really helps out the podcast, and it helps others to find us as we grow. The perks for you guys will grow, and if one day I make enough money, I will get a little team together, and even more content will come out for you guys. So be sure to share anywhere you can. Tell a friend, share on your socials. The links are on the website. Thank you so much. Okay, that's it for business. Let's talk about today's case. Today, we are going to talk about a Russian serial killer named Alexander Pichushkin, aka the chessboard killer. Ever heard of him? Trigger warnings for today are going to be murder and brutality. Let's get to it. Today's case is going to take us all the way over to Russia, which at the time was still the Soviet Union, in what is called Mytishche, which is part of the Moscow Oblast or Moscow region, but the city itself is located just northeast of the capital city. Moscow and the surrounding areas of Moscow in the 70s were completely different than one might think when it comes to the 70s era in the United States. Moscow at the time was living under the state-controlled communist system where, yes, they were guaranteed employment, free healthcare, free education, and even a good price on utilities. But, according to an AI overview of Moscow at the time, the quality of important things like cars, housing, and even appliances were very low. And I guess they had waiting lists for things, so sometimes, like getting a car could take years. During this time, by one personal account of someone who grew up in Moscow during the 70s, they would say that the Russians loved Americans during this time. Even though the Cold War between the two countries was still going strong, Russians were said to love a few things that came out of the West, most notably things like Western movies, Levi jeans, and also they liked to listen to Jesus Christ Superstar. People in Russia during this time didn't have the same freedoms that the hippies and free love people in the United States had. In Russia, although things seemed relatively safe, clean, and what sounds like straight out of Pleasantville, there was a shortage of real estate, so even couples who would usually marry in their early 20s may have to hold off on their physical relationship. It was said that during a Russian-U.S. TV-hosted event with Phil Donahue and Vladimir Posner, there was an American woman who stood up and said that our commercials, our books, etc. revolved a lot around sex, and she wanted to know if Russian media and things of the sort also revolved around sex. Famously, a woman named Lyudmila Ivanova said, quote, "We have no sex and we are strictly opposed to it." Everyone laughed, and the quote became famous that there is no sex in the USSR. completely different than looking at things through 2025 eyes, but back then in Russia, it was almost embarrassing to be rich or to want materialistic things. It would be seen as much more respected if you were extremely poor and you were something like an artist or a scientist or other low-paying job. Having money at the time usually meant that you were either somehow involved in the underground economy, which was looked heavily upon as disgraceful, or you were someone connected to the state, which would be worse. Needless to say, living in a communist state was very different than the world that we have today. This brings us to the birth of today's serial killer, aka the chessboard killer, Alexander Pichushkin. I'm going to call him Alexander, not out of respect by any means, but it's hard to say his last name over and over. Let's see if we can pinpoint anything that may lead us to this guy being such a giant shitbag. Alexander Yurovich Pichushkin was born on April 9th, 1974, to mother Natasha Pichushkina. Alexander grew up in the same apartment that his mother did when she moved onto the 5th floor apartment of a place called 2 Kursankaya. If you took about a 5-minute walk from this apartment, you would run into the north end of Bitsevsky Park. I've also seen it called Bitsa, but I'm going to stick to the Bitsevsky because that's what I've seen more commonly. The apartments Alexander grew up were crowded, plain, and in the USSR, this was the first attempt at public housing on a larger scale. Still, it beat being homeless, and these would be the first real homes that many people would ever experience. Alexander's father was said to have left Natasha and Alexander before he was 1. The complex that Alexander would grow up in with half-sister Katya and mother Natasha was said to be the kind of place where everyone knew each other. There were multiple buildings full of apartments where the kids would play in the courtyard of sorts and people would sit around smoking and talking to a neighbor possibly. 10 of Alexander's victims would come from the same housing complex that he grew up in. There isn't a whole lot known about the childhood or adolescence of Alexander, but one thing that has been reported on repeatedly is the fact that Alexander suffered from some sort of head injury when he was 4 years old. Sources would say that injury caused a change in Alexander's behavior. He became more impulsive and hostile, and sadly, he was ridiculed and bullied in school. So they're coming out with these thoughts that head injuries could be linked to more aggressive behaviors, etc., but I wasn't sure if we have touched on that here on the podcast, so here's a few tidbits for you. According to the National Library of Medicine, when it comes to the topic of TBIs and violent crime, TBIs being traumatic brain injuries, there are different effects that can come along with the injuries, and they can range depending on the severity and the area that is damaged. For example, TBIs can cause problems with planning, concentration, poor attention, and affect the memory. But an injury to the frontal brain systems can cause lack of control of social behaviors, impulse, aggression, and poor decision-making, which is terrifying, really. Obviously, the mild head traumas, especially without losing consciousness, will rarely lead to anything permanent or seemingly serious. So, if you have bonked your head a few more times than you would like to admit, like yours truly, it does not mean that you're going to be a serial killer by any means. But, get this, there was an investigation of sorts done in Sweden, where people up to the age of 25 who had some sort of TBI had a higher risk of being hospitalized for inpatient psychiatric care and were at risk of having any type of psychiatric episode. Then, it was said that the risks were higher of these if the person was older than 25 and the head injury was more severe. So basically, we all need to be wearing helmets. They also did a study with Vietnam War vets and persons who had injuries to their frontal cortexes, which happened to be the part of the brain connected to risk and fear. Well, these people were seen as being more aggressive and violent compared to the other veterans or other patients who may have had lesions on their brains but were somewhere else. Here is a few serial killers you may or may not have heard of that are known to have had some type of TBI. Richard Ramirez, aka the Night Stalker. A dresser fell on him at 2 and knocked him out, and then he was hit in the head with a swing when he was 5, again knocking him out. Then, because of these, he suffered from epilepsy. Peter Sutcliffe, aka the Yorkshire Ripper. His was considered a type of brain injury due to the lack of oxygen while he was in an incubator at birth. Albert Fish, which is basically the worst type of serial killer / cannibal / eats children in the world. I guess he fell from a tree as a teenager and sustained a brain injury of some kind. David Berkowitz, aka the Son of Sam, was badly hurt on 3 occasions, but on the 3rd, being hit by a car was said to have been when he became withdrawn and also started torturing animals. So, that's no good. Henry Lee Lucas, Fred West, Ed Gein, BTK, all of them had some sort of head or brain injury. And look how they turned out. Yikes. I'm sure there are plenty without head injuries, but still. So before said head injury, Alexander was seemingly a quote-unquote normal, happy kid. After the incident, the kids at school were relentless and would tease him for being a kid with special needs. You know, the R word that is so nasty. So eventually his mom took him out of regular classes and school and would enroll Alexander at a school for kids with learning disabilities. When Alexander was a teenager, it would be his grandfather who realized that he was not mentally incapable. Actually, his grandfather thought Alexander to be quite intelligent, so he took him out of the special school and brought him to live with him. His grandfather believed that the school that he was currently in was teaching people to try and overcome their disabilities rather than achieving anything of note. While he was living with him, his grandfather encouraged Alexander to pursue things that involved intellect, and this is when Alexander would start to play chess. He was actually pretty good at it and seemed to enjoy the different aspects of the game. When Alexander was put back into mainstream school by his grandfather, the bullying would return, of course, because kids are dicks. This only got worse when, sadly, Alexander's grandfather passed away and he had to move back in with his mother. Alexander had a rough go of it after he lost his only father figure and the person who he bonded with the most. While he was a teenager later on, Alexander would confess that he committed his first murder in 1992 when he had pushed a child out of a window, and sadly, the boy died. Biography.com would say about the incident that Alexander was questioned about it, but it was ruled a suicide. Oh my god, it's fucking heartbreaking. Can you imagine? Fuck. Alexander would later confess, quote, "This murder, it's like first love. It's unforgettable," end quote. Alexander was able to hold off on killing anyone else that we know of until around the early 2000s. However, around the time that his grandfather had passed away, things weren't going so great for him. He started to drink. In fact, he would not only drink vodka, but he would also start playing chess with the old men at the park nearby, Bitsevsky Park. This is when Alexander would realize that although both him and his chess partners were usually drinking vodka, the effects of the alcohol didn't seem to quite hit him as hard as it did with the older players. Alexander at the time would start to have more sinister thoughts and developed a hobby that was less than okay. I guess Alexander, for whatever reason, found pleasure in recording himself threatening children, where he would then watch the videos over and over again, allegedly to admire the power and the strength that he felt like he had over those victims. What a weird fucking thing to do, though, right? I don't see how threatening or possibly scaring children can make you feel powerful, but alright. Eventually, Alexander would find that his sick little weirdo hobby was not enough to satisfy his disturbing urges. Towards the years 2001 and 2002, people would start to vanish in the area, but they weren't the most public of people, so they kind of went unseen. Alexander liked to pick victims that may not raise a lot of alarms, like bums, elderly people, alcoholics, and the like. When a family did want to report their loved one as missing, sources would say at the time they had to wait a full 3 days before being able to file a police report. That's such a long time. So much could happen in just 24 hours. Can you imagine 3 full days? The police were allegedly at the time the kind of people who were open to bribes, also who drank a lot and didn't seem to care about the goings-on. As more and more families started noticing their loved ones gone missing, the victims' families would start to connect to one another, realizing that their missing people may have had a few things in common. Alexander, now working in a grocery store, seemed to be a regular guy living a regular life. Little did the people around him know that not only was he the reason that people had been vanishing, but he also seemed to have some sort of god complex, sources would say. There were rumors bubbling that the 8.5 square miles of wooded area known as Bitsevsky Park may have something to do with the murders. They had no idea how right they were. It was Alexander's MO to get his victims drunk, whether it be an elderly chess player or a homeless person. He would offer them a drink of vodka, usually luring his victims out into the woods, claiming that they could share a drink over his dead dog that was buried nearby. Sources would say that there may have been some truth to the story he told, as he had been seen walking his dog often after the passing of his grandfather, but it's not known whether the dog was actually buried out in the park or not. Alexander would then offer drinks to his victims until they became sloshed and much less able to care or to defend themselves. After his victims were near defenseless, he would strike. He would usually use a blunt object and hit his victims repeatedly. Sometimes he would use a pipe or even a hammer. He would later confess he usually liked to strike them from behind as a way of surprising them and to not get his clothes as messy with blood. It was then in Alexander's murderous routine to throw the victim down into what was called a sewer pit. But sadly, there were times where the victims were not completely dead, and therefore they would drown instead of dying from the blunt force trauma to their heads. I had to look up what a sewer pit was because I know what a sewer system is, but this is a park we're talking about, so are they the same? Russia seems to have some parts there where plumbing and sewage is a real problem, so I'm not exactly sure what these pits looked like, but if the sewage was as neglected as many articles say, then I'm sure it was easier to hide bodies down them. With the progress of Alexander's murders, so went the progression of his savage attacks. As some of the bodies were being found, it was clear to the residents in the area that whoever was doing this was escalating rapidly. It was said that at some point Alexander decided he wanted to murder more people than the infamous serial killer that was arrested around this time, one that we have covered and you may recognize, Andrei Chikatilo. If you recall, Andrei confessed to 56 murders but was charged with 52. So yeah, if Alexander wanted to beat him in some sick and twisted murder competition, then he had to continue to murder people rapidly. In the Russian media, he would later be referred to as the Maniac, seemingly unable to keep himself from killing, as he would eventually stray from elderly or homeless men to even women and children. In the Bitsevsky Park, there are little boxes that hang from branches, and people will put crumbs inside of them for the birds and the squirrels. One news outlet called Daily Motion showed the boxes and said that there was, at some point a few years ago, someone had started moving these little food boxes deeper into the woods, and at least one victim was found next to one of the small boxes hanging from a tree. One victim, a man named Yevgeny Pronin, was said to have been playing chess with Alexander on May 17, 2001. Alexander would tell Yevgeny that this day was the anniversary of the death of his dog that he loved so much. He asked Yevgeny to take a walk with him to visit the dog's grave, and Yevgeny agreed. The pair walked to the spot in the park that was said to be quiet and isolated, where Alexander would bring out his bottle of vodka. The men would then toast to his beloved dead dog, and suddenly, out of nowhere, Alexander would bludgeon Yevgeny to death, and then proceeded to dump his body into a nearby well. One of the things that Alexander was known to do was take an object like a stick or a broken bottle, sometimes his vodka bottle, and he would shove it into the open wound on his victim's head. This was often noted in the media as the bodies were being found. He didn't rape his victims, instead his sexual pleasure came from the killings themselves. And he particularly would later confess that he, quote, liked the sound of a skull splitting, end quote. Yeah, if that doesn't haunt your fucking nightmares, I don't know what will. Alexander was known to have mixed up his weapons of choice, though. He was said to have shot at least one victim and strangled a few as well. Alexander's quote-unquote killing spree started in the year 2000 and was known to have continued up until he was finally caught in 2006. While Alexander was busy being the beast of Bitsa, or the Bitsevsky Maniac, he was living in tight quarters with his mother, his sister, his brother-in-law, also named Alexander, and his 6-year-old nephew. Apparently, Alexander slept on a couch in the first room that also served as a living room, and his mother Natasha slept on a queen-size bed only 10 feet away from her depraved son, none the wiser. His sister Natya and her husband Alexander and little Sergei all stayed together in the master bedroom of the apartment that Natasha, Alexander, and Natya were all raised in. It was said at least 10 of Alexander's victims lived in the same apartment complexes as him. One source would point out that he personally knew several of his victims as well. One victim who managed to survive, there were only 3 people to survive Alexander, in fact. One victim, a neighbor of Alexander, a man named Konstantin Polikarpov, had been invited out to the park for a drink when the maniac would hit him over the head 3 different times with a hammer, and then he was thrown down the well. Alexander thought the neighbor to be dead, but Konstantin was able to climb out of the well. Unfortunately, because of the severity of his head wounds, he didn't remember what happened to him. He had no idea that it was Alexander who had attacked him. Another survivor was a 13 or 14-year-old boy who was lured to the park by Alexander, offering him vodka and cigarettes. Alexander then hit the poor boy over the head and threw him down the well, again thinking the boy was dead. Thankfully, the boy's jacket had apparently gotten stuck on a piece of metal and he was able to climb out. He tried to tell the authorities about the attacks, but because the boy was young and said to be homeless, the authorities wouldn't listen to him. The only other person to survive Alexander Pichushkin was a Miss Maria Viracheva. Maria, at the time of the attack, had a job as a saleswoman. She was 19 years old and she was 3 months pregnant. Earlier that day, Maria had had a fight with her boyfriend, the father of her unborn child, and afterwards she was crying while she was inside of the subway station in Moscow. Alexander, having noticed that she was upset, started talking to her, and given the state of her despair, Maria took comfort in someone to talk to. When Maria had told Alexander of her situation, he offered Maria a way to make some extra cash, saying that in Bitsevsky Park, he had stashed a few cameras that he had stolen, and he offered her some so that she could sell them for money. I guess at the time Maria didn't know if she would still have a job soon, so of course, given her state, she went along with Alexander, despite the fact that it was getting later. Sources said one way or another, Alexander was able to get Maria to follow him to the alleged spot that these cameras were supposed to be hidden. One source would say that Alexander lifted a lid to a well so that Maria could look inside and see the cameras. Either way, when the poor woman saw an open sewage well, the maniac quickly grabbed her hair and proceeded to slam her head against the cover of the well that was made of iron. Maria knew that Alexander was going to kill her, as she realized there was blood on her face and she was hurting. In this moment, he then grabbed her and threw her down the well where she fell 25 feet. Maria was choking and struggling, but amazingly had survived the fall and the blows to her head, and knew that she had to find a way to survive. Somehow, Maria found the strength and resolve to lift the cover of a manhole and start screaming for help. Eventually, Maria would be taken to a hospital where she was able to give the authorities her attacker's name and address. Oh yes. Turns out, as the pair were walking through the park that evening as they chatted, Alexander had given Maria his name and address. And this is when she realized she didn't live very far from him. Unfortunately for Maria and the rest of the area, the police officer she gave the report to, a man named Kalishnikov, wasn't really interested in doing his job. So he didn't go and question her attacker. Instead, the officer said that he would tell Maria's boyfriend that she was now safe and ask him to bring her some clothing to change into, but there was a catch. Kalashnikov said he would only do these things if she pretended that she had fell into the well, basically doing away with her attacker's story. What the fuck, man? Who fucking does that? Thankfully, sources say later this guy was put in jail for this shit, but this poor woman. A senior investigator, Andrei Supernenko, after the police officer's arrest, said the only reason that Kalashnikov did what he did was because he was basically being lazy and he didn't want to do his job. The investigator would further state that if the officer had done his job, they would have found Alexander, and then said that over half of the victims could have been saved if that had happened. Oh my God, that's so infuriating. So Maria not only went through this whole ordeal, traumatized, I'm sure, but what makes it so much worse is that eventually her boyfriend dumped her, even though she was still pregnant. Thankfully, her attack didn't force her to miscarry, but then she actually saw Alexander at a friggin' store. She said she was so afraid that she ran because he also saw her. She said at the time she was so afraid that she wanted to just hide right then and there, but instead she ran back to her home. Just 2 days later, she left her home and fled, terrified that he was going to come for her and kill her. When asked why Maria didn't go back to the police, she said that they had already not helped her once, and she was afraid because she didn't have the correct paperwork to be living in Moscow in the first place. Maria did give birth to a seemingly healthy baby, but sadly had to give it up for adoption, which must have been heartbreaking if she wanted to keep the baby but couldn't. Sources had said that she was forced to give the baby up. Later on, when Alexander was caught, she was able to help in the investigation. After Alexander was finally caught, he was asked why he chose the people that he knew on purpose. He would say in an interview it was because he felt a connection with the victim. Besides the survival of Maria, there were other chances to catch the maniac or chessboard killer as well. At the time of the murders, a man who was in charge of the sewage treatment plants named Vladimir Mukin had apparently contacted the authorities multiple times that there were human remains being seen washed out of the sewage system. Between just 2001 and 2005, there were 29 different bodies that came through, but sadly, some of the bodies had come from other areas, so not all of them were looked into. Yeah, ABC News, while reporting about this case, said that in the year 2008, there were 1,000 cases of homicide in Moscow alone, and because of the statistics, it's believed that 500 of those were murdered by serial killers. Russia, that is absolutely terrifying. I suppose at any given time, the Moscow authorities must have their hands full, huh? Alexander could have also been stopped after that boy that was mentioned earlier who survived not only had he reported the crime, but after this, he actually saw Alexander at a subway station. Can you fucking imagine? Holy shit. Anyways, the boy ran up to a police officer trying to tell him, but of course the officers wouldn't listen to him again. Another time when Alexander was luring his 26th victim, Alexei Pushkov, into the forest, Katya, who remember is Alexander's sister, had been walking towards him. Nothing was ever pieced together about her seeing her brother walking into the woods with someone. Later on, a neighbor of Alexander, a man named Andrei Konovaltsev, was said to be the maniac's 30th victim. And while Alexander was trying to hide his neighbor's body in the sewer, 2 witnesses saw him. These 2 women contacted the authorities, and when they got there, Alexander just pretended to be someone who was onlooking and curious what happened, and of course they didn't catch him. It was said after this, Alexander sometimes just left the bodies out in the open as to not get caught trying to hide a body again. At some point, one of Alexander's friends, Andrei Maslov, vanished. The investigators had gone to the maniac's home to ask questions, but he wasn't there at the time, so the authorities apparently gave up on the thought and never came back. Multiple times the killer could have been stopped if it weren't for shoddy police work and even just a slight effort in the case. It seemed the authorities would finally start to take notice of these murders and take it a bit more seriously when a former police officer named Nikolai Zakharchenko ended up dead on November 16, 2005. And this victim was left right out in the open. All right, so let's talk about Alexander's last victim, the one that would lead to his demise. The murder took place on June 14, 2006, when Alexander would take a woman he worked at the grocery store with, Marina Moskalyova, for a walk. Sources said another woman that they had both worked with, a woman named Larissa Kuligina, had already disappeared. She was actually already murdered by the maniac, but this was not known yet. Alexander and Marina had taken a walk through Bitsevsky Park when Alexander would attack Marina with a hammer, bludgeoning her to death. The thing that ended up coming back to Alexander was that Marina had, I guess, left a note for her son on where she would be and with who, and it even had Alexander's phone number. So later on, when the son called Alexander asking where his mother was, the maniac said he hadn't seen Marina. This seemed suspicious, so he contacted his father, and his father called the police. Sources said another thing that would end up catching Alexander was that Marina had a subway ticket in her pocket, and there would be found on CCTV footage of her buying the ticket, and who was next to her? Alexander Pichushkin. Just 2 days after this final murder, the maniac would be arrested. Alexander would later confess that as he and Marina were walking in the park that he had actually contemplated on whether to kill her or not, but eventually said because he was already quote-unquote in that mood, he took the risk and spilled her blood. He further said that he couldn't help himself. He said, quote, "I killed so I could live myself. You kill someone and immediately feel relieved. Your shoulders straighten up and you want to live." End quote. This being said at his trial. Alexander Pichushkin was finally arrested and charged with 48 murders, although he confessed to having killed 63 people. Not long after he was arrested and was ready to confess, the authorities were smart enough to bring in NTV to film and even broadcast the confession so there would be no question about coercion of a confession from him. During his trial, it was said that Alexander showed quote-unquote particular cruelty when he would bludgeon his victims to death and then shove broken bottles or other objects into their wounds. He was said to have escalated so much that during just 1 month, he had killed 6 people. Alexander would be quoted as saying for him to have to live without killing would be like someone else having to live without food. Saying, quote, "I felt like the father of all these people, since it was I who opened the door for them to another world." End quote. During a later interview, Alexander would say that Marin had mentioned the note before he killed her, but he did it anyways, knowing that it could come back to him, and felt like the cops didn't need to be taking credit for catching him. Seemingly, this guy's like, yeah, I got sloppy. It's not like they did much to catch me. During his trial, Alexander showed absolutely no remorse for his heinous crimes. In fact, during his trial, he asked the courts to add the additional 11 victims to his count, saying, "It's unfair to leave them out, but really, I think it's because he wanted to be Andrei Chikatilo," which he had already said. What a freak. I guess during the trial, the prosecution read some references from former employees that described Alexander as polite, tactful, diligent, disciplined, probably like in an effort to reinforce that he was sane, even though a psychologist had already done this. When the maniac heard this description, he said aloud, quote, "Why are you studying me so thoroughly?" It's like he doesn't get why people think that this is such a big deal. We've seen people like this before, in my opinion, true definitions of the word psychopath. His own lawyer would say that Alexander was trying to convince everyone that what he was doing was a good thing, and that he enjoyed the complex of being God, getting to choose who would live and die. The Maniac was convicted of the murders in October of 2007 and consequently sentenced to life in prison. One source in an article that came out this year said that this case has renewed Russia's possible interest to reinstate the death penalty, but nothing yet has happened. I would have thought that Russia definitely had the death penalty. That surprised me. During later interviews, Alexander would be asked numerous questions in an article written about this case by Yasha Levine. One of the questions was about prison, where he would explain he's adapting well, he liked the hot water, and was excited that he got a whole 5 minutes to shower. About his lawyer, Alexander would say that he would like to gut him like a fish. Then he took it a step further, saying that he would like to make belts from his flesh, if he could. A real Ed Gein vibe going on. He would state that he didn't believe in God and refuses to read a Bible, saying he didn't choose to be baptized at 3 months old and never prayed and never will. Is it weird that I have something in common with a serial killer? Alexander spoke to the nightmares that he has. Now, I found this interesting. The rest of us may have nightmares about serial killers. Not really me, but so then what do serial killers have nightmares of? Turns out, for Alexander, it's a dog. The dog that he lost. Saying that it was his fault that the dog died, and that he didn't treat her as well as he could have, saying that it left something in his subconscious. I love how this fucking monster feels bad about how he treated his dog, but feels nothing for the dozens of people that he savagely murdered. What the fuck is that? When he asks if he regrets anything, Alexander would say he doesn't regret it at all, nor does he repent. Finally, he spoke to where he would like to have lived if he could live anywhere, and he said Mexico. He said it's warm there and they have forests. He even said maybe he would live a different life down there. When he was told that there aren't forests in Mexico, he would say, and I quote, "Do you want to tell me there are no jungles? Like Freddy Krueger said, Elm Street exists in every city." End quote. That's so creepy. When he said that maybe he could live differently in Mexico, I took it as maybe like he would have been a better person or whatever, but he was still seeking out forests, right? So when I read that, I was like, oh my God, he just doesn't want to be as cold when he kills people. While Alexander has been in prison, he has been sentenced to spend his first 15 years in solitary confinement. But weirdly enough, in 2016, a woman named Natalia visited him, and what's fucking awful? They got married. Yep. Yeah. What the fuck, lady? Are you serious? What is wrong with you? For real, that's the best you can get? Alexander Pichushkin spends his days in a place called Arctic Penal Colony, or Polar Owl, which I guess is notorious for housing terrorists, serial killers, and other infamous people. I guess Alexander doesn't play nice, as he is threatened to kill other inmates, and has to be monitored closely, even in confinement. He now says that if he were ever to get out, that he would kill 2 people, just to kill them, and then rape a woman. Yikes. Please put this guy to death, Russia. Right now, you might be asking yourself, well, if this guy is known as the Maniac, or the Bitsevsky Park Maniac, then where does the chessboard killer come from? Surely it can't be because he played chess as a kid or occasionally in the park. You'd be right. The chessboard killer gets his name from the fact that after he was arrested, the authorities would find in his home a chessboard that was marked in 63 of the 64 squares. These marks, which some sources say were dates, other sources say had coins on them, and still others said were mere markings, each representing his victims. And Alexander would admit that his goal was to fill up the chessboard with victims. And that, my friends, is the story of Alexander Pichushkin, the Bitsevsky Maniac, the chessboard killer. Oh fuck, this guy gives me the absolute willies. The lack of self-control to kill other people, the want to just murder and not give 2 fucks about it just freaks my shit. Also, what is going on over in Russia? I can tell you right now that I am terrified to ever visit that place, but also weirdly, I want to. Do you think that I could spot a serial killer? Are there that many? Do you think that they're born like that, or they just go running around willy-nilly because they can? Also, why did he want to make a skin belt out of his lawyer? I mean, he didn't say nipple belt like Ed Gein. He said flesh. Why is that so terrifying? Also, would he wear the belt or just admire it? I mean, what exactly did he want his lawyer to do for him? I personally hope that Russia brings back the death penalty just for this sick fuck, because if they don't believe that even this guy deserves to die, then what the fuck are we doing here? I feel so bad for the families or loved ones of this guy's victims, knowing that he could have been stopped numerous times. I would sue the shit out of whoever didn't take this guy seriously or take these reports. Get everyone fired. Let's just start over with new police out there, huh? Let's hope that it's not this way anymore. Well, I hope that you guys enjoyed learning about this psychopath as much as I did, and I beg you all to stay out of the forest, okay? Remember, nothing good happens in the woods. Come on back next Monday when we will cover another case here on the Kill File where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye. All right, guys, that's going to do it for today. A few quick reminders before you go. Please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on your platform. It will help the podcast grow and other true crime lovers to find us. Also, check out the website, TheKillFile.com, where you can suggest a case, find our merch shop, and submit a listener file. Follow The Kill File on your favorite social media platforms. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, and TikTok. Of course, you can always subscribe on YouTube as well. Find all of the links for the socials on the website. Come back on Mondays wherever you get your podcast fix when we will cover another case on The Kill File where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye.